So I've been asked to do a video tutorial on how I make my ribbon, or some people call it laced cutting boards. So here we are. I'm gonna make a quick tutorial. The first thing I do is I create a cutting board blank. Now you can design it all and then cut your blank to your design. I prefer to just use the wood, make the blank, because that allows me to, analyze the boards and, choose the best parts and how I want to lay it out. So the first thing I did was cut up some black walnut and some maple. And here we are. The black walnut's a little thicker. It's 8/4 instead of 4/4, so I got to cut it down to match the maple on the bandsaw. And this is why I like to pre-make the blank. I use a lot of rough cut lumber and then mill it myself. And I like to go through and cut out any really bad defects or large knots or issues with the boards. So here I am. There's actually a split on the other side of this board. So I'm going to break it up and then re-glue it together and basically cut out any of the bad spots. Then I'm going to cut myself a piece of maple so it's about the right size, add it to the walnut. I'm actually going to add a piece of hickory here at the same time, just for a stripe down the middle, give it something, make it look a little nicer, add a little pizzazz to the board before I go and start doing the ribbons. And lastly, before glue up, I go through and joint all the edges, and I do the front back jointing method where my old ass jointer here is not perfectly straight to the back, which I know it's not. If you flip them back and forth, it doesn't matter how much it's out. When you flip the next board over, you end up with a flat plane gluing it together because both angles end up matching. So here I go and plane all the parts together. And then it's time for your basic everyday glue up. Add some glue, spread it out a little bit, put all the pieces together, clamp it down, scrape up any excess, clamp it square and flat. And there you go, let it sit overnight. And now that we have that blank, we take the measurements off the blank, import them into Fusion 360 here, drop a blank, and then start to draw the ribbons. And all you do is you start with this spline draw tool, and you kind of draw some S corners and terminate. Now you want to make sure it goes beyond your cut space. And there's a reason for that. When you go to duplicate the line, sometimes it will go inside the actual item and then you won't get a final fill solid object. So that's not terrible. Actually, it's pretty simple and I like it. So let's offset it. And I've gone 5 millimeters. I have found 5 millimeters to be the right size for what I'm trying to do. It allows me to cut it fairly easily with my 3.14 bits, quarter-inch bits. It's easy to make the ribbon pieces for it, but it generally gives you a decent. I can't go much smaller because then I would have to go to a much smaller bit, and I tried that and I kept breaking bits. So I do that, and then I do it 2 more times, and again I do it 3 times because I like the look. Again, I do it 3 more times. Gonna fast forward through this, move them around. It's all what you personally like the look of. Get it the way you want it. Okay, now we have everything we need to start cutting. I actually am going to go through and cut each one of these ribbon slots individually. And you just basically hit the extrude tool and select the ribbon, and you have to make sure you select the whole ribbon. So you hold the shift key, select all the little parts, and then extrude it negative whatever. I usually do about 10. You want it to cut through. My bit's a little small. I've found if I cut too deep, I get a lot of deflection because of the thin bit. So I would rather cut a groove than go back with a jigsaw or a bandsaw and cut it out and then use a flush trim bit. Otherwise I get a little too much deflection on the small bit. And you go back and you select each one and do the same thing. But you have to do each one individually because you want to cut individually. -10. And the last one. Again, you have to make sure you select the whole line. Oops, I don't want to do that. Just want to do the space. I don't want that line. There we go. And -10. Extrude, -10. Okay, now, before going into machinery, what I do now is I actually hide these two. You do one at a time. And you just right click on them and suppress feature. So I actually only have the one. I also go through and hide sketches because it screws up stuff. Now we go into manufacturing and we have your setup. Again, this is not a Fusion tutorial. It's just how I do the actual ribbing into Fusion with the CNC. So I already have my open builds, I already have a setup made, and what I'm going to do now is a 2D pocket. Then you can go down and choose pocket, or I have it up here already, pocket, and just select the groove. I'm using my Jenny bit, which is 3.17. Select. I pretty much have everything else pre-set up here. I do like to do multiple depths, again, because it's such a small bit. It deflects a lot. I turn off stock to leave, I turn on smoothing, and I hit OK, and I let it go to town. And it creates a cut, generally 2 or 3 cuts. If you want a nicer finish, go back here, mouse. If you want a nicer finish, edit. You can do, this one here. Not only can you do multiple depths, but you can do finishing passes, which is not a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing. I generally leave it kind of stock. It takes a little longer to cut, but by doing that, again, because of the small bit and the deflection, it basically goes along. I don't know if you can see it here. It does the cut, and then it comes back, and it does a real fine pass next to it. So the first cut gives you a lot of deflection. The second cut, it just kind of smooths out the face, and it does it on each level. And there you have it. Create an NC program, name it whatever you want, and post. Then all you do is go back into design, suppress this one, unsuppress this one, and do the same thing over. Go into your manufacturing, just edit this, edit, yes, delete all your missing stuff. And then select a new tool path. Make sure everything's the same. It is. It saves all the settings generally. Click OK. It'll do the same thing for the next one. Again, do the same thing for the third one. Suppress this one. Suppress feature. Unsuppress this feature. Go back into manufacturing and do your third select. Edit. Yes, clear your selection. It doesn't actually clear it, which is kind of funny. Okay, and it does all your toolpaths. Save your toolpaths. I didn't do it with the second one, but I've already done all this. So there you have it. That's the fusion part of it. Let's go to the CNC. So now we're at the CNC. You've brought your files over with an SD card or a USB stick, however you prefer. I will tape it down with blue tape and CA glue. I prefer the blue tape and CA glue because I found double-sided tape moves. No matter how good of a double-sided tape you have, it will have a slight bit of play in it under the force of the CNC. So I'll always use blue tape and the glue over double-sided tape. So I spray it all down, get it locked into place, and then I find the center, bring the CNC over, center the CNC, get it homed, and, well, start cutting. Normally I'd use the dust boot sitting there, but I kind of left it off so you could sort of see what the CNC was doing, cutting the board. Not sure if it helped any at all, but whatever. So we take it off the CNC now, and we bring it over to the bandsaw. And I'll use the bandsaw to knock the two halves apart and cut it as cleanly and as closely as I can to the actual groove that's already cut from the CNC. So I can then use a flush cut bit on the router table. And here we are at the router table. And we're going to do just that. We'll flush trim it back to the actual cut and clean it all up and get it ready for glue up. And of course I forgot to hit start on the other camera, so all I have is the view with the arm in my way. But it's very simple. We just flush cut it on the router table with a flush bit, do both sides, get it ready for glue up. I do come along and hit it with a little bit of sandpaper at the very end just to get rid of any fuzzies or anything from the router. Okay, I don't have one of those thin strip jigs that everyone's making all fancy these days. I really don't think I'd like them. I kind of like this better. This push stick is already cut to the thickness. I just push it right through the blade. So, yeah, I never have to move the fence. I never have to change anything. I can set my fence to the thickness and just keep pushing material through. And as you can see, I just use a dual push stick method. One of them pushes up against the fence. You could use a feather board here instead if you like. But with this push stick, you just let it ride right on through and let the blade cut right through that push stick. And you'll get repeated, easy, beautiful, ready to glue up thin strips, whatever size you've set them at. Then it's just rinse and repeat. Use as much material as you want, cut as many strips as you want. In this case I'm using Paduke and walnut for this particular stripe. To glue up, I generally try and do a dry fit the first time and just see how it's gonna go together. After a quick dry fit, it's time to glue it all up. And I smear glue on every side. Make sure you do both sides and all the faces. I find it just is better and safer when you're trying to glue up little ribbons like this. Now the one thing you do have to be careful of is, and you might see it here, as you clamp it, it starts to shift from side to side depending on the angles and forces and whatever. So you may have to, as you can see here, clamp it on the sides to hold it in line. It's not difficult, but it's just something you have to pay attention to and get right. It's a little tricky if you're not used to doing it. It's not difficult. It's just something you have to pay attention to. And once you get everything clamped into place and you know everything's sealed up, you scrape off the glue, go along, scrape off more glue, and add a few more clamps to make sure everything's going to hold. Let it sit overnight. And there you have it. One little line glued up. On to the next one. And we let it cure overnight. Completely different. And this is coffee. Coffee is required. And everything else is rinse and repeat. You gotta, ow, sliver. You gotta clean this up. That hurt. So now you do a general flattening to make sure it's good and flat so you can put it back on the CNC, re-CNC the next line, pretty much rinse and repeat, cut, glue, clamp, and let it sit overnight again. Then it's rinse and repeat for a third time. Clean it up, CNC it, clean up the edges, glue it all back together. There you have the glue up. And it's actually sat a couple days. And that is that. Now we just got to cut a shape. Okay, this very much depends on my mood and the board I'm working with. In this case, I'm going to hand draw. Sometimes I'll draw it on the computer and use a CNC to cut the outer edge. I'm going to hand draw it in this case because I'm not going to use a CNC because there's some knots there, as you see when I flip it over, and there's a big split in the walnut that I want to cut out. So yeah, sometimes I cut it by hand and sometimes I do it on the CNC. But there you go. That's what it's going to be. So normally I would probably just take it over to the bandsaw, but I just got this fancy new Makita cordless jigsaw because my old 20-year-old Bosch jigsaw crapped out. It's actually probably older than 20 years old. And, I have to play with the new toy. This is quite literally the very first cut this saw is ever making. So there you go. Let's cut it out with the jigsaw. Mask. Wear your mask. So once I get it pretty close with the jigsaw to the shape I want, I'll bring it over to the belt/spindle sander and sand it down to its final shape and size. Then I hit it with a regular old random orbital sander to smooth it out a little bit before I bring it to the router table. So on most of the thicker cutting boards and charcuterie boards, I always like to put a back bevel, back chamfer on the back side of the board. So here I am. I'll do it multiple cuts so I don't get a lot of chip out. And here I am back beveling the board. And then it's off to final sanding. I didn't record hitting it with the random orbit all the way up to, I think I did up to 180 on this particular one. I do it by hand up to 220. Then I hit it with water, raise the grain, and hit it with 220 by hand again. You just have to brush it over after you raise the grain. You don't have to go crazy sanding. So, and yeah, there you are, final sanding. When all done sanding, I go and vacuum it. And something that doesn't get used anywhere near enough, or you don't see it on all the YouTube people, is a tack cloth. Tack cloths will take off a lot of stuff that even the vacuum won't on something like a cutting board and get the sawdust off. And now for the most satisfying part of the whole build, oiling. Adding the oil just makes the wood pop and it just shows all the beauty of the wood. So I usually just add the oil, rub it in, add more, kind of flood it. You can see I'm putting in quite a bit. You want the wood to soak it up really, really good. And you just keep adding oil. I usually take a day and do it 3 or 4 times before I do a final wax on it. But yeah, the oil really makes the wood pop. I make a very basic mineral oil and beeswax finish. I make it myself, boil them together, and give it a coat. And this is your final result. Glamour shots.